The whole world celebrated. Science had its greatest moment. But here's what the Nobel Committee never announced. There was a third person. She did the most critical work, and they used her data without her knowledge. Her name was Rosalind Franklin. And what happened to her isn't just a footnote in a history textbook. It is one of the most calculated erasures in the history of science. London, 1920. A girl is born who will one day take the most important photograph in the history of science. But the world she was born into had already decided what women were allowed to discover. Rosalind Franklin was the kind of student who made her teachers uncomfortable, not because she was disruptive, because she was better. At 15, she'd already decided she would become a scientist. Her father told her that was not a suitable career for a woman. She became a scientist anyway. She studied at Cambridge during a time when women couldn't even officially receive degrees from the university. She did the work, passed every exam, and watched men receive the certificates she earned. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. By the early 1950s, Rosalind Franklin was working at King's College London using a technique called X-ray crystallography. The basic idea: fire X-rays at a molecule, watch how they scatter. Use the pattern to map the shape of something too small to see. Simple concept, brutally difficult execution. Franklin spent over a year perfecting the process, adjusting humidity levels, exposure times, crystal preparations. Most scientists gave up at this point. Franklin refined it until her images were the sharpest anyone had ever produced. On May 2, 1952, she took a photograph called Photo 51. It was the clearest image of DNA ever captured. It contained the answer to one of the biggest questions in the history of biology. That photograph showed, unmistakably, that DNA had a double-helix structure. Franklin knew exactly what she was looking at. She was methodically preparing to publish a complete, evidence-based paper. This is important, because what happens next depends entirely on understanding that she was not guessing. She had proof. She was building the case. She just needed a few more months. At the same time Franklin was working, two other scientists were racing toward the same answer: James Watson and Francis Crick at Cambridge. They had a problem. Their models kept failing. They didn't have good enough data. In January 1953, without Rosalind Franklin's knowledge and without her permission, Franklin's colleague Maurice Wilkins showed Watson Photo 51, the photograph she had spent over a year creating, the photograph she had never agreed to share. Watson later admitted, in his own memoir, in his own words, that the moment he saw the photograph, he immediately knew the structure was a helix. He said, and I'm paraphrasing his exact words here, that the image was so stunning it made his mouth fall open. Within weeks, Watson and Crick had cracked the structure. Their famous 1953 paper in the journal Nature described the double helix. It included a line, buried near the bottom, that vaguely mentioned they had been stimulated by a general knowledge of Franklin's unpublished work. Stimulated by a general knowledge. That was the only credit given to the woman whose photographs solved the puzzle. Franklin herself never knew. She moved to another research institution, continued her groundbreaking work, and was never told that her photograph had been used. After King's College, Franklin moved to Birkbeck College, where she made groundbreaking discoveries about the structure of viruses. She published 17 papers in 5 years. She was at the height of her scientific powers. And then in 1958, Rosalind Franklin died. She was 37 years old, ovarian cancer. 4 years later, in 1962, Watson, Crick, and Maurice Wilkins, the man who showed them her photograph without permission, received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. The Nobel Prize is never awarded posthumously. Rosalind Franklin, who had died 4 years earlier, was not mentioned in any of the 3 Nobel acceptance speeches. Not one of them stood at that podium and said her name. You might be thinking, this was the 1950s. Things were different then, and that's true. But here's the question that should actually keep you up at night. How many Rosalind Franklins are in our history books right now, listed as footnotes, as assistants, as colleagues, while their discoveries carry someone else's name? Historians of science have a term for this. They call it the Matilda effect, the systematic suppression and denial of contributions made by women scientists. Rosalind Franklin is the most famous example, but she is not the only one. Every name on that list represents an answer humanity got, but for decades attributed to the wrong person. Which raises a question that's harder to sit with. What answers did we lose entirely? From the women who were stopped before they ever got to take the photograph at all. In 1962, the Nobel Committee did not say her name. In 1968, Watson wrote a memoir that diminished her further. But in 2023, 70 years after Photo 51, one of the most powerful AI systems ever built, the one that cracked the protein folding problem that had defeated science for 50 years, named AlphaFold, and in its acknowledgement section, it cited Rosalind Franklin as one of the founding contributors to structural biology, 70 years late. But history, it turns out, is not always written by the people who win. Sometimes it's written by the ones who were right. This is Elvoro, where history gets brutal, so you can understand how it actually works. If this is the first time you've heard Rosalind Franklin's name, subscribe, because the next name we're going to tell you about is even more buried than hers.